The president of the John Locke Foundation, here to present to you the May Civitas poll of 2021, where we survey North Carolinians in these regular statewide surveys to find out what voters really think about the issues that are going on today. We always have a guest commentator. This month's guest commentator is Dr. Chris Cooper, who's a professor of political science at Western Carolina University. We've had him on before, before the merger of the John Locke Foundation and the Civitas Institute. He came on last year. This month he's on because there's one question of particular importance to him, but he's also a great commentator with a lot of knowledge of North Carolina politics. So we'll get right into the poll presentation. As always, we'll go over the methodology for you, and we always want questions and see if we can provide answers. I can't always promise an answer, but we do like questions. We try to get to the questions at the end, and so we'll save the last 5 or 10 minutes on that. But without further ado, we'll get right into the poll presentation for May 2021. All right, let me share my screen here, and we'll start it right up. All right. Again, this is a statewide survey of 600 likely voters around North Carolina. The poll was conducted May 6th through the 8th, 2021. As always, if you would like to know more about the methodology and that sort of thing, it was 600 likely voters, gives us a margin of error in a state of this size of plus or minus 4.0%. This was a mixed mode method done through live phones, text polling, as well as email invitations. Have some technical difficulties there. There we go. If you would like to live tweet the poll, we gave some Twitter handles here for you. This is the @John Locke, or this is the John Locke Foundation, which is @JohnLockeNC. Dr. Chris Cooper, who is a welcome guest today. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Cooper. We'll hear from you for just a second. Is @ChrisCooperWCU, because he's out at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee. I am @Donald Bryson. The poll was conducted by Signal Polling. Well, they are @Signal, CYGNAL. And while we talk about the poll, it is #Civitas poll. But we'll hop right into Dr. Cooper. Dr. Cooper, how are you today?
Doing great. Glad to be here talking to you. I always love any conversation about data in North Carolina politics. So we got them both together today.
Right. How's the weather out there in Cullowhee? Do you have any gasoline out there?
We have very little gasoline. I mean, it's Cullowhee, so there's very little gasoline to start. And what little there was seems to have disappeared somewhere in Florida. Hopefully we'll get it in a few days. I'm full, so that's the good news.
Well, that's good. I had to drive to and from Charlotte yesterday, which was a little, I don't know, I was a little angsty about it, but we got it done. But I'm glad that you're there. I'm glad that we were able to do these polls virtually so that you don't have to drive to Raleigh and worry about being able to drive back. That was the situation I was in. I had enough gas to get to Charlotte, but not necessarily come back. But I worked my way through that a little bit. But are you ready to get into the poll a little bit?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about that. All right, as always, we're starting out with the electoral environment here in North Carolina. What do people think, feel, job approval ratings? Are they optimistic about the country, that sort of thing? The first question is, what do you think about the direction of the country? We asked voters, do you think that the United States is generally headed in the right direction, or has it gotten off on the wrong track? We have a majority of voters who are pessimistic about the country, with 55.1% saying it's off on the wrong track, 38.8% in the right direction. I'm sure Dr. Cooper is going to talk about the partisanness of this a little bit, but I will say that it was just last year before the 2020 elections that Democrats were feeling very pessimistic about the country and Republicans were very optimistic. But what do you think about this, Dr. Cooper?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know me well. You know I'm going to go left and right. You'd be good on defensive basketball. But no, that's to me. I mean, this is all about partisanship, right? And so partisanship is clearly coloring how people see it. I think it also shows just how much the presidency is driving people. So these people are sort of interpreting this question clearly through a presidential lens. We have a Democratic president. Democrats think things are going pretty well. Republicans not so much. When the tables were turned, just as you said, we saw the opposite response. So I think this just shows the nationalization of state politics, the nationalization of everything in politics, and just how much of a presidency-centered system we currently have.
Yep, and we'll see how or if this tightens up as we get closer to the midterm elections last year, and even after the midterm elections, I would expect to see some sort of shifting in this. But this is a question that we do every month, and we'll continue to track it. And that's the beauty of the Civitas poll, is that we do it regularly. We do 8 to 10 of these a year, and so we have a long historic record of seeing how this has gone, ups and downs. over the past 16 years since we started polling. All right, we'll move to generic ballots. It's a little difficult to do a statewide poll where we talk about specific state legislative or congressional races because those are in specific geographic districts. But we can ask people a generic question of if you're going to vote for state legislature, are you going to vote Republican, Democrat, or someone else? And the same thing for Congress. And so that's what we do every month with this. We ask the generic ballot test for state legislature and Congress. We see the Republicans have jumped out to a little bit of a lead within the margin of error, but still a little bit of a lead on the state legislative ballot. That is different than usual. We very rarely see Republicans in the lead at all. If they are, it's usually only by 1 point. Now they're up by 3. Typically, Democrats lead that historically within the Civitas poll, and then we have the generic congressional ballot where Republicans have a very, very slight lead, 0.8% on that. Dr. Cooper, what do you see here?
I mean, one, just the fact that the state legislative results and the congressional results are so similar. I think, again, this kind of idea of nationalization, that partisan lenses are increasingly driving almost everything about American politics. Mm-hmm. I think it's an interesting question right now when we don't really know, we don't know what our congressional districts or our state legislative districts will even look like, nor do we know most of the candidates. And so it's really interesting to me that such a large proportion of people are willing to answer before you even really know what your choices are going to be. And I think that's the point of these generic questions. And I think it's really important. And again, just highlights partisanship, nationalization of American politics.
It does. It really does. It all comes home. I think we're all sort of victim of the 24-hour news cycle, which focuses so much on Washington, D.C., and it's difficult to separate the two. Next, as most people who are watching this know, because you're likely a very informed voter, we have a U.S. Senate election next year. And so there are a few people whose names have popped up as potential candidates or have declared as candidates for U.S. Senate next year, both on the Republican and Democrat side. So we thought we would go ahead and do a name ID and favorability test on those names. And sorry, that's the heat map for the state legislature and congressional ballot. And we can come back to that if we need to. Well, I've skipped questions, I'm sorry, but we'll come back to that. As we look at the name test for Pat McCrory, a former governor, Mark Walker, former member of Congress, Ted Budd, current member of Congress, those 3 are Republicans. Then we have Sherry Beasley, who was the immediate past state Supreme Court Chief Justice, Jeff Jackson, a current U.S. Senator, or not U.S. Senator, but state senator, and Erica Smith, who is a former state senator. All of these people's names have been bandied about, or they have declared as candidates for U.S. Senate next year. And so what we see far and away, Pat McCrory, obviously as former former governor, has the largest name ID. His favorability isn't necessarily great, but his name ID is something to be said compared to the rest of these candidates. What do you think, Dr. Cooper?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. This is such an interesting graph, right? And so, and I think for folks, I'm sure people that are watching this tend to be a little more right-leaning, but I think people on the left should be paying attention to this poll just as much as people on the right are. And I think it shows, one, Pat McCrory clearly has a lot higher name ID than other folks do. People know who Pat McCrory is. Obviously, he's been governor. He's, been a radio personality. He's been mayor of Charlotte. I mean, he's on Meet the Press. People know who he is. But all that name ID comes with some negatives, and clearly his favorability numbers are part of the problem for him. I also think it's interesting that Jeff Jackson, somebody who's been in the General Assembly, has about as much name ID as Walker and Budd, somebody who's been in Congress and is currently in Congress. And so I think it just shows what a good job Jeff Jackson has done from a not a particularly prominent position in the North Carolina General Assembly, the minority party, and yet 1 in every 4 North Carolina voters kind of knows who he is. And so I think he's doing a good job getting his name out there. And then I'm not sure if you're going to get into it or not, but the differences between, do we have a graph on the differences between the likes that kind of crosstabs between Walker and Budd and Beasley and Jackson?
I don't have that right now, but if you have some insights on that, and by the way, the poll is the top lines and the crosstabs are live on our website right now. If people want to go to johnlocke.org, click on the tab at the top that says polls. The crosstabs and the top lines are completely available to anybody, and you can follow along with what Dr. Cooper's about to talk about.
Great. So yeah, and I was glad to see these a couple of days ago. Appreciate getting the chance to look at them. It looked to me like Walker and Budd have a lot more kind of crossover appeal, which we would think, right? Ideologically, they're very, very similar. They have similar demographic profiles. I think they're like 4 years apart in age. And so if you like Walker, you probably like Budd. That does not translate as much to McCrory. So I really do see the Republican side of this race shaping up as Walker and Budd kind of in one lane, McCrory in the other. The question to me then is, can Walker and Budd, differentiate themselves from one another? On the Democratic side, you saw sort of similar things where Beasley and Smith had more kind of shared favorability, and Jeff Jackson was kind of out there. Jackson people tended to think pretty positively about Beasley and Smith. The same wasn't quite as true the other way. Beasley supporters were a little bit more circumspect about Jackson. Now, clearly, they like Jackson more than the Republicans, but perhaps less so than Smith.
When I do look at this graph, I do see, while Sherry Beasley doesn't have nearly the name ID that Pat McCrory does, it's still 35%, basically at 34.9%. It's 10% ahead of Jeff Jackson, and that ratio of favorable to unfavorable is just really high. She could give people a run for their money on this, even though I still think, for someone who's been elected statewide or been in a statewide race anyway, her name ID should be higher, but it's understandable. Pat McCrory ran for statewide race at least 3 times, so I suppose that's understandable.
Right, and obviously governor versus Supreme Court justice.
Right. Yeah, people forget that we even elect Supreme Court justices, but we do. Right. All right, let's talk about job approvals for governor and president. We asked the question, generally, do you think that, or do you approve or disapprove of the job that Joe Biden is doing as president and Roy Cooper is doing as governor? And you can see Joe Biden is getting sort of a lukewarm reception here, which is sort of surprising so early in his presidency, with 48% approval, 49% disapproval. Roy Cooper is still in a much better spot, that more like what we've seen him historically, at 53% approval, 41% disapproval. We've seen his approval ratings up actually in the 60s before. Last month, he was only +3 in approve versus disapprove, or not last month, but in March, excuse me, that was our last poll. But when you think about what happened from the March poll until this poll, he reopened schools. And I think that probably led to a bump in the approval rating, because he was starting to get a little on the edge. And we actually had a plurality of people who disapproved of his handling of reopening schools.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the school opening was key. I think he had sort of ridden this COVID wave, and the wave was starting to kind of crash on him, but he kind of pulled it out in the end. And I think you see that in the kind of re-rising of his approval numbers. The Biden numbers, just to compare to nationally, it does look like Biden is slightly less popular in North Carolina than he is nationally. So that's clearly something to look out for moving forward. If we know that the top of the ticket is going to drive a lot of these votes down ticket, then Biden's, not bad, but not quite as high favorability as he has elsewhere is going to be notable.
All right. We talked about that. Here's the heat map. I want to return to just the Senate candidate name IDs just real quick. You see Pat McCrory performs very well among registered Republicans and self-described conservatives. And then Beasley and Jackson are running neck and neck with self-described liberals. But Beasley, in terms of just sheer partisan nature, is running about 9% ahead of Jackson among registered Democrats. I don't know what to make of that yet. I just find it interesting.
It is interesting. And obviously there's a lot of noise here, with particularly for anybody whose name is not Pat McCrory. There's so many folks that just don't know who these people are yet.
Right.
They're still figured out. But yeah, I mean, to me, what this spells is a really interesting competitive environment on both sides. I would argue that's probably a good thing for the state if you've got competitive Democratic and Republican primaries in a pretty purple state. Hope we're going to really have some real choices here, which will be nice.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting. And yet again, North Carolina is going to be at the epicenter of American politics, which is exhausting sometimes. All right, let's talk about the size of government and what voters think of the size of government. And again, I want to reiterate, when we talk about voters in this poll, these are not registered voters. This is a likely voter poll, which is typically what we do with our statewide polls. in addition, I get a lot of questions, well, who do you poll? How do you know who to poll? Our pollster puts together the demographics model off of the 2020 turnout, the previous statewide election. And so in terms of turnout, how many Republicans or women, African Americans, Democrats, all that puts together, that's the turnout model that our poll is based on. And so that's who we polled, and that's how we got it statewide. All right. We asked the question, generally speaking, would you say you favor smaller government with fewer services and lower taxes, or larger government with higher taxes and more services? And looking at this, and this is a typical response that we've had on the Civitas poll over the past, I think 10 years ago is when we first asked this question. 57.4% of people said they would like a smaller government with fewer taxes and services. 32.7% said they would prefer a larger government with higher taxes and more services. I would venture to say if you ask this question in a European nation, you might get different results because they have a different sort of culture and engagement with their government. As a conservative, I find this very heartening, but what do you think about this, Dr. Cooper?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'll avoid whether it's heartening or disheartening.
Oh, sure, fair enough.
Yeah, no, but empirically, I agree with you. I mean, I think the results are pretty clear. I think the unaffiliated numbers are the most interesting here. Like, look, we know where the Republican folks are going to stand. We know where the Democratic folks are going to stand on this question. But seeing the unaffiliated folks right at 50%, I think really shows us, exactly where the fault line is in the state of North Carolina. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I'm with you. I would love to see sort of comparisons to other nations on a very similar question.
Right. And this is a typical question that U.S. pollsters ask. I don't know that I've necessarily seen it asked in another country, but I know that Pew asked this question, Quinnipiac asked this question an awful lot. And now I want to find out if they ask it in other countries. But the unaffiliated voters, I think that sort of goes to what we hear political consultants say all the time in North Carolina, is that yes, there are a lot of unaffiliated voters. Yes, that's the largest voting bloc, but they tend to be partisan in their own nature or ideological on their own and identify with one party over the other, even though they register as unaffiliated.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And one thing I like about the way y'all conduct these polls too is that sometimes folks come in from out of state and they will talk about independent voters, which of course is not a category.
It's not.
In North Carolina politics, unaffiliated is. And so I really appreciate that y'all consistently include the proper terminology, which is the one people use when they're filling out their voter registration form.
We try to be accurate. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. All right. We asked this question. I'll be very candid. I stole this question from the Economist poll done by YouGov just last week or a week before last because I thought it was an interesting question. I wanted to see that was a national poll, and I wanted to see how it would play out in North Carolina. And the question is, how concerned are you, if at all, that the Biden administration will do to increase the size and role of government in U.S. society? The numbers are very high, or much higher than what I thought they would be, with 59% saying that they were concerned overall, either very or somewhat, and 39% saying they are not concerned.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing that stands out is, a little more than 1 in every 4 Democrats said that they were concerned. So I think that tells us something in these unaffiliated numbers. Again, of course, we're going to see the Republican spike, but the real driver and what's interesting here to me is that, 1 in 4, 28% is a pretty high number for Democrats, and 56% amongst unaffiliated is, again, pretty high, more than we're seeing in other questions. So I think it's worth paying attention to. And it shows, we tend to think that parties kind of issue ownership we talk about in American politics. But people tend to trust the Democrats more, fairly or unfairly, on issues around education, tend to trust Republicans more around issues of, again, fairly or unfairly, of defense. And so I think government expansion or overreach, depending on your perspective, tends to be viewed as kind of a more negative thing for Democrats. And I think we're seeing that play out right here.
Right. And as we go through the poll, from time to time, we'll talk about different regions of the state. When we talk about regions of the state, the Raleigh area, the Charlotte area, on this slide, you see the coast. This comes from where the people are within a television market. And so when we say the coast, we actually mean the Greenville, New Bern, and then the Wilmington television markets. And that's something that I'm going to be watching going into the 2022 election cycle, because a lot of people view North Carolina as becoming more purple. And I think that our electoral environment in North Carolina is becoming more and more complicated as happens with a quickly growing state. But one thing that I've read a lot of analysis from, and we have we follow voter registration tracks here. If you want to check out our website that we maintain, carolinaelections.com, that's maintained by Dr. Andy Jackson here. But the coastal areas of North Carolina are actually turning more red, while we have the urban areas, particularly the big urban centers of Raleigh, Durham, and Charlotte, are turning more blue. You see how the voters from the coast were overwhelmingly more concerned about expansion than maybe other geographic areas. Um, that's just something to watch about how the coast is changing and how the coast is turning red.
I think you're exactly right. I think the regional breakdown has always been kind of a key fault line in the state of North Carolina, so it's important to keep watching that as well.
It is. It's a very long state. Mani-O is not Murphy.
No, it is not. It is not, as people from both places will tell you.
Absolutely. Or, in your case, we'll say Corolla is not Cullowhee.
There you go.
That's what we'll say. All right, let's talk about the economy, which is always fun to talk about. But is it? The economy is really only news if it's bad news. I don't know if it's good news, but it's not necessarily good news right now. We asked the question, which one of the following strategies to improve North Carolina's economy specifically, do you prefer? Across the board tax cuts, targeted incentives and tax breaks to specific businesses, increased taxes and government spending, something else, or are you unsure? And we had a plurality at 38.5% saying they preferred across the board tax cuts, 15.5% saying they preferred targeted incentives, 17.7% saying they wanted increased taxes and government spending. Dr. Cooper?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think it's a really interesting question to watch, and I think it falls mostly with what we'd expect. One thing that stood out for me, I mean, of course, we're going to see Democrats and liberals say taxes and state spending should be increased, but the 18 to 34 mark, I do think is an interesting one to keep track of. And to return to this unaffiliated point, a lot of those folks are the ones who are most likely to be unaffiliated voters. And so seeing that kind of generational divide obviously should be something that stands out for Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, when you got younger folks feeling very differently than folks who are, we'll just say, farther along on the lifespan.
Obviously, we didn't ask this question. We don't have this detail, but do you think that the 18 to 34-year-old demographic is influenced by the fact that a lot of those people are in some sort of higher public education in North Carolina?
I mean, certainly that could be it. Obviously, yeah. So educational attainment would be slightly higher amongst that range. I'm not sure, and part of it, and this is not a knock on the poll, 600 people, a very good size, but 18 to 34 is a pretty big bracket. So we're unclear kind of how many are on the 18 side versus the 34 side. Again, that's every poll have that same problem, but it makes it harder to tease out exactly why it is. But I think it's one thing worth paying attention to.
All right. So in case you missed the news, Apple is going to open up a research and development campus here in Wake County. So we asked the question, on April 26th, it was announced that Apple has selected Wake County, North Carolina as the location for its newest research and development campus and will potentially create 3,000 jobs. The state government authorized an incentive grant through a program called the Jobs Development Investment Grant, or JDIG, which would provide Apple a tax break worth up to $845.8 million over 39 years. Do you support or oppose this agreement between the state government and Apple? I just want to go back real quick. You had, in the previous question, you had 15.5% of people saying that they, in order to improve the economy, they wanted targeted incentives and tax breaks to specific businesses and industries. Then we get to this, and we have 46% overall support this specific deal for Apple, while 38% oppose. It's obviously not heartening to people who are more free market oriented and don't like this sort of corporate welfare program, but we do know now where the public stands on it. I'm fascinated by the juxtaposition between people saying they don't like targeted incentives and then being okay with one for Apple. Obviously, we don't know for sure. I'm guessing that the name Apple has something to do with at least some people's opinion on this question, but I'd be curious to see what you think about this, Dr. Cooper.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Also think the question sort of leads with the 3,000 jobs, right? So if you could go back in time, it'd be fascinating to ask a version of this question that leads with 3,000 jobs versus a question that leads with the expense.
Right.
My guess is you'd see some pretty different results. I'm guessing this is the kind of question that the sort of question ordering is really going to matter. I know that's kind of way deep in the weeds, but I think it's important as we're trying to understand complicated concepts through polling. The order you tell them the good and the bad matters, frankly.
Right, and we labored over this question an awful lot because despite what well, I'm going to say what the left thinks about the Civitas poll that we do here, we try to ask even questions because if we're putting out push polls, then we haven't really accomplished anything. We actually want to know what the public thinks. And while we're not particularly in favor at the John Locke Foundation of $846 million going to any particular corporation as opposed to not cutting taxes for other companies, part of that is a performance-based grant that they would potentially create 3,000 jobs. And so we tried to make this a balanced question if we possibly could.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the folks I hear from on the left, I'm sure they have a lot of criticisms of the John Locke Foundation. I know that. The poll doesn't tend to be something that I hear a lot of criticism about. I think there's a general sense that it's a quality poll that's putting information out there. Obviously, the Locke Foundation is going to use it for their purposes, as they should, since they're funding it. But these are data that I would say that people in North Carolina more generally can trust.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So you're an awful nice guy. That's why we have you on here. We're going to use these recordings, send them to donors or something. Thanks.
Just on Thursdays. I'm a jerk.
Okay. Just on Thursday. I won't tell your students. Don't worry. All right. And just we do have a heat map on this. I didn't see anything that really popped up on this. We see the support and opposition are fairly uniform. They're only 8 points apart. The support's a plurality, not necessarily a majority. I didn't see anything really high other than the fact that moderates were at 54%, which I kind of see that. I can absolutely see how that happened. And then low propensity voters, those voters that vote in 1 out of every 4 election, or how we have it labeled 104, or at 57%.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's interesting, and I think the lack of a partisan difference. I mean, yes, there is a partisan difference, but it is a lot smaller if you sort of compare the partisan difference we see on this question versus the partisan difference we see on other questions. It's a lot smaller here. So we say partisanship's a hell of a drug and is going to determine a lot of what you think about politics. This is one where that's not as true.
Yeah.
So take from that what you will.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about COVID-19 because we haven't talked about that enough in the last year. Remember, it's the 1.5 year anniversary, not yet 1.5 year anniversary, but of 2 weeks to flatten the curve. But no, seriously, this is an issue we face every day. And so we want to see where people were, particularly on if people were wearing masks, what they think about wearing masks, and what they think about the idea of a vaccine passport, an international vaccine passport. So we asked the question, in the past 7 days, how often have you worn a mask on your face when outside your home? We have 61% of the people saying that they've worn a mask some, most, or every time they've been outside of the house. And then, you have some people who still aren't wearing masks or wearing masks to a less extent. But I was interested by this. 2 in 10 Republicans never wear a mask, which is at 21%. I think 9.8% of people said that they never wear a mask. 8.7% said they rarely wear a mask.
And that's, so we talked in the last slide about, sort of small partisan differences. Obviously that's out the window in this one. I mean, we're seeing huge, so every time 80% amongst Democrats, 29% amongst Republicans. Obviously this has become a identity politics issue for Democrats and Republicans in some ways. I would argue to the detriment of public health. I would love to see both of those numbers a lot higher.
What do you think about the gender gap on this?
So let's see here. Yeah, so females a lot more likely. A part of that could be that is also co-varying with partisanship to some degree, right? So we know we have a gender gap on partisanship, of course. So that's part of what's going on here, right? We're not controlling for partisanship when we're looking at that gender gap. But still, that's notable. 61% of women say every time they're out versus 47% of men. That's a sizable difference.
Right. It is. All right. Then we asked about the idea of vaccine passports. We asked the question, would you support or oppose requiring vaccine passports that prove vaccination against COVID-19 to travel internationally? I was actually surprised by these results with 49% support, 44% opposing, 5.7% saying they neither support or oppose, and 1.3% being unsure. Obviously, we again have a partisan divide here with the Republican voters at 72% in opposition, Democrats at 71% support. But this is I honestly wasn't sure when we asked the question how this would come back. I was surprised to see a near majority in support.
Yeah, same thing here. And I'm wondering if part of that is the travel internationally clause.
Right.
I think if you said vaccine passports to get into a concert, vaccine passports to get into a sporting event, I bet those numbers would go down. But I
Or
think
to travel to another state. Right.
exactly. But to travel internationally, so by definition, well, unless you go to Mexico or Canada, I assume you can be traveling by plane, and so I think that's probably what's driving this. But it surprised me as well. I did not think the numbers would be quite this high in support. And again, I put that as a good piece of evidence that this is probably not in may not follow as well what many of the folks watching today want to hear, but the Locke Foundation's putting these data out there, so I think it's a good thing.
It's real data. It's what people actually think, and that's what we need to know. If we're going to actually try to teach people about public policy, we need to know what they actually think and know first.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about some potential constitutional amendments here in North Carolina. The General Assembly is talking about several different possibilities. Nothing has actually passed both chambers yet with the requisite majorities that would be, or supermajorities that would be needed to pass a state constitutional amendment. But we asked a series of questions. The North Carolina General Assembly is considering a variety of amendments to the state constitution. Would you support or oppose the following amendments? And then we had them worded this way because when the General Assembly passes a bill, they actually have to put the ballot language that would go in front of voters on the bill. We changed this one very slightly. We asked the question, a constitutional amendment adding the Taxpayer Bill of Rights to the North Carolina Constitution that would limit the growth of state spending to inflation plus population growth, require yearly deposits in a savings reserve or unfunded liability reserve, return excess revenue to taxpayers, and submit tax increases to a vote of the people. We changed this one very slightly. Like I said, the current language in the bill, and I cannot remember the bill number, instead of saying Taxpayer Bill of Rights, it actually says Taxpayer Protection Act, but then the title of the bill is Taxpayer Bill of Rights, so we just adjusted for that. Overall, 56% of voters said they are in favor of this constitutional amendment and 22 in opposition. Dr. Cooper, what did you see here?
Yeah, I mean, sort of just to jump back one kind of half step for folks. Those folks watching this are super informed. They know this, but right. So this whole discussion of crossover, these bills don't have to make it over a crossover.
No, they
right?
don't.
So it can be brought up later. I think that's important, kind of a weedy point. And I think most voters don't know a lot about these, and we'll talk about. I think it's three of them that are on here. I think this is a really good baseline look at what folks are thinking. I would be interested to see the difference between the folks who receive the poll through phone versus through text or something where they can read. A lot of these questions, they're good questions, they're real text, but they're complicated. And I don't know how much people are able to retain this when they're listening to something on the phone. So I'd be very curious to see that breakdown.
And that's completely fair. And I don't know that I necessarily have that breakdown. We do ask this question this way because if voters were to be able to vote on it, it passed the General Assembly, this is how they would see it on the ballot. But that's a very fair question because it's a long question, right? And you start saying things like in a savings reserve or unfunded liability reserve, and I think that's about the time people's eyes gloss over. But essentially, this would be a constitutional amendment that would control the growth of state spending over time. We've seen this work in Colorado. Other states have tried to pass this, but I think the only one that actually has it in place right now is Colorado. And it's something that's been discussed for a long time in North Carolina. I think if we move to the heat map, we see a few things. And obviously there's a little bit of partisanship in this, but we still see pluralities of Democrats and unaffiliated voters in favor of it, 75% of Republican support.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So some partisan difference, but smaller partisan difference. And I think any of these with less partisan difference, that's where you can thread the needle in North Carolina politics, right? I mean, I argue that we are a purple state still in almost every way. And so what are things that can actually get passed through that might have some chance of getting through, the governor's veto and the General Assembly, things where the Democrats are not completely opposed, Republicans aren't completely opposed. Obviously, we don't know the future of this bill. We don't know what happened. Tons of education would happen on this campaign if it were to be passed. But this is a really nice baseline look at the issue.
It is. It is. I think anybody who's wanting to push this bill could be heartened by this poll and know that there is likely a path forward.
I agree.
All right. North Carolina is a right to work state. We've had right to work in the state constitution, or not in the state constitution, but in state statute since March 18th, 1947. I was going to say 74 and flip those numbers. So next year will actually be the 75th anniversary of North Carolina being a right to work state. But it is not in the state constitution. That's something that's being discussed at the General Assembly. So we asked people if they would support or oppose a constitutional amendment to provide that the right to live includes the right to work, and therefore the right of persons to work shall not be denied or abridged on account of membership or non-membership in any labor organization. We see larger support for this than we saw for the Taxpayer Bill of Rights at 64% support, 15% in opposition.
That's right. I mean, this, polls very well right now. This is another one that would be really interesting to see what's going to happen with some public opinion campaigns on either side of it. But right now, again, baseline looks to be a popular bill.
It should be. Well, the thing that has always popped out to me when we have polled right to work in North Carolina is the overwhelming support from the African American community. You see it's actually a percent higher than the Republican support for this at 72%. I have conjecture that there are some older African Americans in the state that remember the history of unions in the South, and that the closed shop sort of agreements were meant in some ways to prevent African Americans from working. And that's why right to work has been supported by African Americans for so long. But typically this is thought of in a partisan manner, and you see Democrats and left-leaning organizations opposing right to work. But when you ask the question straight out, that African American support's really, really high.
It is. Yeah, no, I agree. It is a striking number. I've always kind of been curious in some of these right to work questions, what would happen if the word union were mentioned? I don't know the answer. I'd be really interested to know. But obviously, y'all did the right thing by asking the text that would actually be on the ballot, which is the right way to approach this.
All right. Let's talk about eminent domain really quickly. This is a constitutional amendment that appears every 2 years at the General Assembly, and for whatever reason appears to stall in the state Senate. But we'll see what happens. It's already passed the state House, and I know there's some conversation down there. But this would clarify the state government and local government's power of eminent domain. And so it would be a constitutional amendment to prohibit condemnation of private property, except for a public use. And to provide for the payment of just compensation with right of trial by jury in all condemnation cases. We have 44% support with 13% opposition, and that's a complicated question, and it's no surprise that we see 27.6% are just unsure.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to point to as well. I think again, this is a really good baseline. I'm glad we're getting these data out there. I'd be curious to see how this moves with some education. 27.6 is a big number.
It is. It is an awfully big number that swings either way. You see, those 3 of 4 voters that they might miss a midterm election every now and then. 38% of them said that they were unsure of the question, and these are people that are fairly engaged voters, and that's interesting. And only 50, Republicans pride themselves as being the party of conservatives and private property rights, and only 50% of Republicans support it, 9% oppose, and then we've got 27% who just have no idea what they were just asked.
That's exactly right.
All right. Let's talk about the literacy amendment, and before we go into this amendment, Dr. Cooper, do you mind spending just a moment and explaining what this part of the state constitution is?
Yeah, so this is, so we've had 3 state constitutions in North Carolina. And so there's been sort of discussion. The last one we got, there was discussion about getting rid of this. So right now there is a phrase in our state constitution that says that every person presenting himself for voter registration should be able to read and write any section of the Constitution in English language. This has since been ruled unconstitutional. It's illegal. You can't do it. This was a tool used in the Jim Crow South to disenfranchise African-American voters. And this is not one of these questions that's up for grabs where it depends on which side of the aisle you sit on. This is a fact, right? These literacy tests were used to disenfranchise Black voters.
Explicitly. I mean, that the people who got it passed said that explicitly.
That's right. This is not a both sides. This is not an either or. Everybody agrees on this, right? So it's still in our state constitution. We brought it up for a vote once before when we got the 3rd state constitution. And of every amendment that came up, it's the one that didn't pass. We weren't able to get rid of it. So every few years it gets brought up. I rarely will put down kind of what I think the right policy solution here is. I will say on this one, I think the right thing to do is to get rid of this thing. It's racist. And well, it's racist. That's the end of the story. The good news is we have tons of Democrats who agree with this. And I think Andy Jackson from Y'all's Institute wrote one of my favorite lines on it. He said, it's a barnacle that needs to be scraped off of North Carolina's ship of state. So I think we've got at least the potential for folks who know to say, well, you're right, left, or somewhere in the middle. We need to get rid of this thing.
That's right. It came about in 1898. Well, I'll give that history in just a minute. I just want to make a note real quick. We're getting towards the end of the poll. If you would like to submit questions via Facebook, you can do that. We're on Facebook Live right now, or you can email Brooke Medina, who's our communications director. She's at bmedina@lockhq.org. If you have questions about the poll, we'll be glad to answer them at the end. But yeah, this amendment to the Constitution, this was added into the Constitution in the election of 1898 after the only successful coup of any type of government in American history with the riots in Wilmington, the Wilmington race riots, where they sort of the Jim Crow Democrats overthrew the fusionist Republican government, and which led to sort of a run of state politics in the fall of 1898 elections, and they put in what they called the Suffrage Amendments, which included adding this literacy requirement into the state constitution and implementing a poll tax, which, to Dr. Cooper's point, has been ruled unconstitutional, both of them, federally, but it's still in the state constitution. It's something that just needs to get scraped out. And we asked the question, would you support or oppose a constitutional amendment to repeal the requirement that every person presenting himself for voter registration shall be able to read and write any section of the Constitution in the English language? And then we see how it came back with only 39% in support and 46% in opposition.
Yeah, that's right. So this, I mean, I think pretty clearly we're going to need some education around this. My guess is that a lot of folks, most folks don't know the history of this. Most folks don't really understand where this is coming from. So I think if it is passed out of the General Assembly, which I hope it is, I think it's a bipartisan bill that has a chance. I do think there's going to have to be some education, and we're seeing that in the outcome of these results.
Right, and we do. The number that I was the absolute most stunned by is the opposition that we see from the African American community, with 60% of African Americans actually being opposed to this when it was put in place to prevent them from voting, more than 100 years ago. That was a real head scratcher to me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think most folks just don't. I mean, I think it's a really important issue, but it's a weedsy issue, and not every person knows that. So I think this, again, it's a good baseline. I'm hoping if this passes that really both parties will try to make sure that this actually passes this time, that we get this thing out of our state constitution, and that we can at least take this small symbolic step to having a better North Carolina.
We will, and I think that's right. It's not anything that's going to functionally change anyone's life. People don't have to be able to write part of the state constitution in the English language, but it's one of those things that's just the right thing to do regardless. And now we know where the public is, and I think there needs to be some education on it, but I was surprised to see where the voting public was, but again, now we know. Looking for any questions that we might have right now. Was there anything, Dr. Cooper, that just stood out to you overall from this poll that we didn't spend some time on?
I'm trying to think. I mean, yeah, I'm glad we talked about the constitutional amendment issues. I think that all stood out to me. And again, the intra-party conflict on the Senate race, right? Within party conflict, I did think was interesting. That, of course, every Democrat likes the other Democratic candidates more than they like the Republicans, and the Republicans is the thing. But there does appear to be kind of a Bud Walker coalition of Republicans and a McCrory camp, and there does appear to be a bit of a Beasley Smith camp and a Jackson camp, and I think that's interesting and worth paying attention to.
What I'm going to put you on the spot. What happens if I can bring this back up? What happens to the Senate race if Laura Trump jumps in?
Can I just say chaos and we close out? I mean, really, I do think it's going to be chaotic. Obviously, Bud and Walker are both campaigning pretty hard to get Trump's endorsement. They both made statements about how they went to Mar-a-Lago. I think if Lord Trump gets in, it's anybody's guess. I assume, heck, I don't even know what I would assume. It's going to be chaos.
Do you think we have any dark horses on the Democrat side, or the candidates that have been talked about sort of in this poll are it?
I mean, yeah, it's early. And
it is very early, incredibly early.
Right. And so, and look, we won't rehash the whole Cal Cunningham thing, but we all saw what happened last time. Sometimes things come out about candidates on both sides that changes their electoral fortunes in some significant ways. It is possible to build some coalitions that we don't see coming. So, yeah, it's absolutely possible. We do have other candidates. I think it's really important to mention this is not, the field is a lot wider than the folks that certainly that I've been talking about today. And it's just going to be hard to break through with the kinds of fundraising numbers that the top candidates are already getting out there.
Right. I'm curious to have your insight on a primary date. Obviously, we found out earlier this year that the census data was going to come out later, which was going to push back when state legislators, not just North Carolina, but all of them, were going to be able to draw congressional maps, which is going to have to push back municipal races and primaries. When are we going to end up with a primary next year?
Yeah, that's another $10,000 question. If I knew the answer, I'd be headed to Vegas right now. But it could be delayed. I think, again, this is going to be a chaotic time. I think the Larry Trump thing makes things chaotic. I think the redistricting cycle being pushed back is going to make things chaotic. And then we got to remember, too, we've already got folks running for Congress that don't even know where their district is going to be. So actually, I think Dallas Woodhouse might have had on y'all's site that Bo Hess, who was running in the 5th, is now running in the 13th.
Right.
You've got people running for districts that are not exactly sure where they're going to be. The 11th, my neck of the woods, there's, a baker's dozen candidates almost already running for a seat we don't know the outlines for. And so I would expect we're going to see some candidates shifting right after these maps finally come out, and it's going to be chaos.
It is. It's going to be, well, I mean, it's going to be chaos. I was going to say it's going to be fun. And for people observing, it's going to be a lot of fun. But if you're involved in it, I don't know how much fun it'll actually be.
And it's confusing for voters, and I think we need to remember that too. That candidates are, I think Bill Hess even had on his website, he says one place he's running in the 13th, but then his video still talks about the 5th. It's hard to articulate a single message if you don't have the district you're running in. It's not. It's a mess.
Right. No, it is. It's absolutely a mess, and it's hard to figure that out. I think North Carolina has rushed to move its primary earlier in presidential years because we're the 9th largest state in the country, and we would like to be relevant to that conversation with people dropping out like flies every time a round of primaries happens. But I don't know that it matters quite so much in a midterm year, right?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Right. The advantage, there obviously is no advantage in being earlier in a non-presidential year like there is in a presidential year. Right? In a presidential year, it brings money, it brings influence to your state, it brings all sorts of things. That's just not here in a midterm election.
It is. Well, any predictions or anything about President Biden's job approval ratings? Is he going to go up? Is he going to go down? What's going to happen with the infrastructure bill?
Yeah, it's going to be real, right? So infrastructure should be one of those issues that Democrats and Republicans can both get behind. Right? It almost became meme-worthy how often we had infrastructure week during President Trump's term in office. You would think the Democrats would get behind it, but I don't see a lot of hope for partisan compromise. And I wish I could say something different on that. Biden's job approval ratings, we'll see. I think if the pandemic continues to get under control, we return to normal, I would expect that his job approval ratings will rise some. At the same time, there's a reason that it's, again, almost a meme at this point that the president's party tends to lose seats during the midterm of his first term in office. And I think we're likely to see that. Of course, the question is how many seats does the party lose? And that's, again, if I knew the answer to that one, I'd be in Vegas.
Oh, yeah.
This conversation.
Vegas are running a lot of campaigns, making a lot of money, and good for you. Well, Dr. Cooper, thank you for joining us today. When's your last day of class, or have you had it?
Yeah, we're in final exam week right now, so we're in the midst of grading and everything that comes with that, and looking forward to get some of the grading done with and back to other projects.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. As always, we're always glad to have you on, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Bye.